handsome Hollywood actor known for starring alongside such legends as Bette Davis, Joan Crawford, and Elizabeth Taylor. His roles on Broadway, a classic episode of The Twilight Zone, and winning an Oscar for the feature film They Shoot Horses, Don't They? He was also known for his alcoholism and his many marriages, including a troubled union with Bewitched star Elizabeth Montgomery. And then, 3 weeks after marrying his fifth wife, Kim Schmidt, the newlyweds were dead. Hello and welcome to The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, author of suspense novels about the dark side of love. And this week I'm putting a spotlight on the case I'm calling Shooting Star. Gig Young began life far from the bright lights of Hollywood. He was born in 1913 in St. Cloud, Minnesota as Byron Ellsworth Barr to John and Emma Barr. After living in Washington, D.C. for a few years, the Barr family settled in Waynesville, North Carolina, located 30 miles southwest of Asheville, nestled between the Blue Ridge and Great Smoky Mountains. Handsome, dark-haired Byron caught the acting bug as a student at McKinley High School in Washington, D.C., which he had moved back to, appearing in a number of school plays throughout his high school career. Once he graduated from high school, he paid the bills as a used car salesman while studying acting at night. Eventually, he was ready to try his luck in La La Land, and a buddy said he'd give him a ride west if he paid for the gas. The Pasadena Playhouse provided Byron's first real taste of being a legitimate actor, after he applied for and won a scholarship to study at the famed Performance Arts Theater. It was a grueling experience, as Byron explained to the Washington Post in 1978, saying, quote, "I had 2 jobs to support me, never rested, but it was a great training, and when I landed the part at Warner Brothers, I was ready for it." The part was a small role in a 1940 slapstick comedy, Misbehaving Husbands. Byron eventually signed a supporting player contract with Warner Brothers after a studio talent scout saw him and future TV Superman George Reeves in a play called Poncho. George also landed a supporting player contract with Warner Brothers, so there was something about that play. Byron continued to work steadily in bit parts while under contract at Warner Brothers, including appearances in Sergeant York starring Gary Cooper, They Died with Their Boots On with Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland, and the Bette Davis flick The Man Who Came to Dinner. About 6 months into his Warner Brothers contract, Byron starred in the film The Gay Sisters alongside Barbara Stanwyck as a character by the name of Gig Young. Apparently, the preview cards for the movie referred to Byron as his character's name, Gig Young, and Warner Brothers said, "You know what? We're going to change your name to Gig Young." Byron was hesitant, but later told the Chicago Tribune that he reasoned, quote, "there'd be no confusion with some other actor named Gig." The newly minted Gig Young began to see his fortunes change, eventually starring again with Bette Davis in Old Acquaintance, this time as her love interest. It was around this time that Gig left Hollywood to enlist in the United States Coast Guard for the duration of World War II. And upon his return to the movies, instead of going back to Warner Brothers, he decided to take his chances as a freelancer for several studios. The gamble paid off, as Gig began to score leading roles coupled with what would become his bread and butter during those years. Or as actor Al Lewis, Grandpa from the Munsters, who starred with Gig in They Shoot Horses, Don't They, told the Archive of American Television, quote, "He was the best friend of the guy who gets the girl, but he was never the guy." Nevertheless, Gig eventually cultivated an image of the laid-back, dashing, and elegant man about town. In 1951, Gig scored his first Oscar nomination for playing an alcoholic in the drama Come Fill the Cup alongside James Cagney, and he got his second nod in 1958 for Teacher's Pet opposite Clark Gable and Doris Day. A year later, in 1959, he starred in the classic and critically acclaimed Twilight Zone episode Walking Distance, which Rod Serling's daughter Jody told the Sci-Fi Channel was the episode her father cherished above all, calling it a, quote, "very personal story for him." It was an all work and no play for Gig. In between movie roles, in 1940 he married his first wife, Sheila Stapler, who he had met at the Pasadena Playhouse. He tried again in 1950 with Sophie Rosenstein, a drama coach at Paramount and a woman who was several years older than he was. Soon after they married, Sophie was diagnosed with cancer and died a mere 2 years after the wedding. Wife number 3 was actress Elizabeth Montgomery. Yes, that Elizabeth Montgomery. Bewitched Elizabeth Montgomery. This was pre-Bewitched when they met. And Gig was Elizabeth's second husband. He was 25 years older than she was, almost as old as her famous father, actor Robert Young. Set up on a blind date, Elizabeth was completely smitten with the dashing and handsome Gig, and though he worried about the age difference, they were in love. And the couple married in a simple church ceremony in Las Vegas on December 28, 1956. By all accounts, in the beginning, it was a happy union, with Elizabeth not only encouraging her husband through bouts of insecurity over his career and helping him to feel more comfortable in social situations, she did all of this while matching Gig, who was an alcoholic, drink for drink. As his agent Martin Baum noted in the book Final Gig by George Eales, quote, "He drank excessively by my standards, and Liz was drinking right along with him. But they seemed happy." However, as Gig's friend Helena Starling said in Final Gig, Elizabeth was lonely. Another friend who declined to be identified told George Eales that it was their opinion that the reason Elizabeth drank with Gig was so that she could spend some time with him. Adding to Elizabeth's distress was that Gig was still married to the ghost of his second wife, Sophie, who was probably the love of his life. Throughout the home that he shared with Elizabeth, he had stuffed the drawers of like tables and that kind of thing with stacks of pictures of his dead wife. Herbie Pilato, author of a biography about Elizabeth called Twitch Upon a Star, summed up the marriage in an interview with the Daily Mail by saying, quote, "Elizabeth was 22 and infatuated, but Gig Young was an alcoholic, emotionally abusive, and probably physically abusive as well. She tried to save him, but their marriage broke down." The couple divorced in 1963, and Elizabeth would, of course, go on to become a huge star on Bewitched while racking up 2 more marriages. And Gig's greatest professional triumph was just around the corner. In 1970, he finally won the elusive Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for his turn as the alcoholic. Again, you see a theme here. Most of his roles that he wins acclaim for, he's playing an alcoholic. He was the alcoholic dance marathon MC in the 1969 film They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, which also starred Jane Fonda. He told the New York Times later that year that winning the Oscar was, quote, "the greatest moment of his life." While it seemed as though his professional life was at an all-time high, he continued to struggle in his personal life. 9 months after divorcing Elizabeth Montgomery, Gig married real estate agent to the stars Elaine Whitman, who was pregnant, and she later gave birth to Gig's only child, a daughter named Jennifer. His alcoholism began to pull his career into a downward spiral. He was replaced by Larry Hagman, yes, Larry Hagman from Dallas, JR, who shot JR, for 2 episodes of the popular TV show The Rogues. And in 1974, Mel Brooks fired him from Blazing Saddles when he collapsed due to what was termed at the time as an alcohol withdrawal, but some people say that he was actually having an epileptic seizure. But regardless, Mel Brooks fired him and replaced him with Gene Wilder. After divorcing Elaine and engaging in a lengthy battle with her over child support for their daughter Jennifer, who Gig even denied was his daughter, in 1977, Gig met the woman who would become his 5th wife, 31-year-old Kim Schmidt. Born Ruth Hannelore Schmidt in Germany, Kim, as she would later rechristen herself, was dazzled by celebrity and the trappings of success, becoming particularly enamored with Hollywood. She graduated high school at 16 and beelined for Melbourne, Australia, before finally making her way to Hong Kong 2 years later, where she cultivated careers in advertising, tourism, and the art world. Blonde, voluptuous, and ambitious, Kim had grown up devouring movie magazines, with Gig Young being one of her favorite actors. Through a former boyfriend, she secured a position as a so-called script girl on the movie Game of Death, notable for being Bruce Lee's last movie as he died during filming under highly mysterious circumstances. After Bruce died, the filmmakers basically had to scrap something like 90% of the footage and build a whole new story around a new cast. And as part of that overhaul, that's where Gig was cast as the best friend of Lee's character. And it was basically him talking to a stand-in for Bruce Lee while the filmmakers went back and spliced in some of the footage that they had shot previously of Bruce Lee. I mean, it sounds kind of weird, right? And Gig himself said the whole thing was kind of eerie. By this point in his career, Gig was finding it harder and harder to land good roles, much less hang on to them. Remembering his lines had long been a struggle for him, and compounded with his alcoholism and by now dependence on tranquilizers, Gig was long past his days of being cast as the debonair best friend in A-list feature films or prestige productions on Broadway. Even crap was hard to come by, having been fired from the play The Archbishop's Ceiling, which, even though when it opened it was a flop, it was still humiliating for someone of his stature to be dismissed. And it was that despair that led him to Game of Death. Clearly, a kung fu movie was considered quite the come down for an Oscar-winning actor who had made movies with Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn, Bette Davis, Cary Grant, and Elizabeth Taylor. But roles were hard to come by, and for someone battling as many demons as Gig Young, keeping busy probably felt like the best kind of lifeline. While Game of Death might not have had the cachet of Gig's previous projects, starry-eyed Kim was ecstatic to be there. With her blonde good looks, easy sex appeal, and vivaciousness for life, Kim reminded Gig of his ex-wife, Elizabeth Montgomery. For her part, Kim guesses, seemingly correctly, that Gig needed someone to take care of him, and she gladly took on the role of mother and cheerleader as Gig wooed her with flowers, letters, and phone calls. Gig became increasingly dependent on the all-too-obliging Kim, telling her that she was the reason he was able to kick booze and pills, and how badly he needed her in his life. He just about had her fooled until she discovered that he had indeed gotten back on the bottle. She kicked him to the curb, but he managed to woo her back, something that her friends were not happy about. As noted in Final Gig, her friends felt that Gig treated Kim badly, that he was too old, he was a hopeless alcoholic, too depressed, too everything, and that she would be better off getting out while the getting was good. But Kim could not say no to him, and it was suggested that in part, much of Kim's lust for the bright lights of America is what fed so much of her fascination with Gig. Joanne Helming, a colleague of Gig's, suggested in Final Gig that while Kim was fond of him, the relationship was perhaps a bit of a means to an end for her, for Kim. She'd always had a dream, apparently, of conquering America. She wanted to be in Hollywood, she wanted to be around stars, and who better to smooth her entree into that world than an Oscar winner, even if he was past his prime. And Gig kept pulling her back in. As Final Gig notes, over time, their relationship became, quote, volatile, with Gig questioning if a woman with a big, forceful personality like Kim was the woman for him. They would fight, make up, neither one, it seems, for whatever their individual reasons were, able to pull the plug. And as 1977 drew to a close, in perhaps a moment of weakness, Gig convinced himself that he should make Kim wife number 5. Kim, however, was content to just live together, and she continually rebuffed his repeated marriage proposals. She wanted to keep her freedom, which he interpreted as her preparing herself to eventually leave him if the going got tough, so she has an escape hatch. I'm not married to him. I can walk out the door. Easy. Done. I will say, this was the 70s. This was the women's liberation movement, right? And this was a time when a lot of young women were opting out of marriage, whereas Gig came from a time where marriage was the logical next step in a relationship. Also, this is probably where the massive age difference, so Gig was 64 to Kim's 31, was also likely a factor. Kim, she's nearing her prime, while Gig was battling Father Time, not to mention the other demons that he was wrestling with. And then there was this kind of mothering role that Kim perpetuated that Gig seemed to feel that he needed. So on a lot of levels, for a lot of reasons, they're just mismatched. They shouldn't be together. But when has that ever stopped two people, right? As the pair continued their unpredictable dance of on again, off again, Kim was confident she'd always land on her feet, telling her family in a letter referenced in Final Gig, quote, "One thing is for sure, I'll always be all right." Kim decided to pack up her life in Hong Kong and move to New York City with Gig. It was quickly becoming de facto that they would marry, though Kim was in no rush to walk down the aisle. In a letter to her parents, Kim wrote of carefree bliss, of how much she was enjoying life, learning how to drive, reading 2 books a week, she's swimming, she's taking tennis lessons, and if Kim is to be believed, Gig himself was flourishing, telling her parents that people frequently commented that he was looking trim and elegant, younger than he had looked in years, and that, of course, she was the reason why he was looking so great. She also shared that, despite these joyous times, quote, "I'm still scared. Getting married will change the happy atmosphere." Gig had decided to star in and direct a comedic stage play called Nobody Loves an Albatross, which he viewed as a comeback of sorts, a vehicle that could make him a lot of money and put him back on the A-list. By this point, he'd had a brutal falling out with his best friend, vocal coach Bert Knapp, as well as with his longtime agent Martin Baum, and was displaying increasing paranoia and a raging temper. During rehearsals for the play, which were not going well, in part due to his inexperience being a comedic stage director, he's terrorizing everyone with his tirades. Panda Hoffman, who was Elizabeth Montgomery's cousin and the girlfriend of another longtime friend, witnesses firsthand the increasing tension during rehearsals of the play, saying in Final Gig, quote, "I thought Gig ought to be institutionalized, to be treated for some sort of nervous breakdown." She'd always known Gig to be a gentle soul, but that man was slipping away by the day. To make matters worse, his alcoholism, which had always been an ongoing struggle, was seemingly surpassed by his alarming addiction to pills. Bob Douglas, who Gig had considered to bring in to take over directing Nobody Loves an Albatross, shared in Final Gig that in Gig and Kim's bathroom he saw a virtual pharmacy, saying, quote, "I'm not exaggerating when I say he had to have a double table to hold all the pills. Little bottles, big bottles, 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 bottles." As Nobody Loves an Albatross swirled down the toilet, Gig and Kim began to focus their attention on renovating their unit at the Osborne Apartments, a co-op building on West 57th Street between 7th Avenue and Broadway in New York. Although apartment 1BB needed major electrical and plumbing repairs, Kim and Gig happily ensconced themselves in the apartment. In a letter to her parents from October of 1978, referenced in Final Gig, Kim notes the apartment's 20-foot ceilings and balcony where she has her office. She writes, quote, "Gig looks up here and says, 'How's my Juliet?' And I say, 'Just great, Romeo. Couldn't be better. How romantic.'" I personally never think Romeo and Juliet's the greatest reference when making to a love story, but that's just me. The construction of the apartment, which when people came to visit this apartment, it gave them it has a very creepy, claustrophobic feel. There were no windows in to let in any sunlight and these cathedral ceilings, so it's already kind of got this gothic kind of quality to it. And somewhere along the line, someone had installed a stained glass window, which when you lit it up from behind, that was meant to simulate daylight. So it was impossible to tell what time of day it was in this apartment. Despite the career setbacks, the substance abuse, the off and on relationship, life in this creepy, broken down apartment, Kim and Gig made their union official, getting married at City Hall on September 27th, 1978. A newspaper strike meant there wasn't much attention paid to the wedding in the press, but it was done. Elaine Stritch, Broadway legend and former fiancé of Gig after second wife Sophie had died, and before his marriage to Elizabeth, had lunch with Kim and Gig later that day, and Elaine recalled in Final Gig that she had pushed him to do a play with legendary theater director and producer Hal Prince. I mean, this is someone who really could have put him back on the map, but she says that he was hesitant and says that, quote, but Gig was afraid. Gig was always afraid. That was Gig's problem. He was always afraid. For her part, Kim was keeping up the charade and letters to friends and family of being deliriously happy. But, truthfully, she was disappointed that the wedding hadn't made the big splash in the press that she would have expected for a big movie star like Gig Young. Even though he is on the downward slope, he's still an Oscar winner and all that. She admitted to another friend that she was lonely in this new land, this foreign city, and that all of their friends were Gig's friends, not hers. Finances were also an issue, as renovations on the broke-down palace, their apartment, those renovations were draining their bank account, and Gig hadn't worked for most of 1978. Despite Kim's PR campaign and her letters to friends and family about this blissful union, according to neighbors, the couple fought often. The brawls drawing comparisons to the battles between George and Martha in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Following the wedding, Gig seemed to be grasping for something, but something he wasn't quite getting from Kim. He wrote her a heartfelt letter pledging to, quote, I'll give it all I've got if you will. So he's maybe sensing she's slipping away or something's not quite working. On Friday, October 13th, Gig met up with Elaine Stritch again, this time without Kim. And according to what Elaine shared in Final Gig, she could tell that he was distraught. And she says that he couldn't quite put his finger on what was causing him so much unease, stating that he loved Kim and everything was terrific, but, as Elaine said to him, but it's not quite right, is it? She urged him to put the brakes on all the drama, go to AA, and make some new friends. They had agreed to meet for tea a few days later, but Gig never showed. This was the last time that Elaine saw him. No one is really sure what Gig did over those next few days. He had sort of unofficially adopted the building's manager, Constance Matsoukas, as a surrogate confidant/shrink, spending hours in the basement bending the guy's ear about all of his problems, his family life, his faded movie career, his regrets, including that, quote, kung fu crap. He cried over the death of his second wife, Sophie, and shared fond memories of Elaine Stritch. And the ever-present skepticism about his marriage to Kim continued to plague him, as he said to Constance, quote, you know, if a marriage is not ideal, the quicker it's dissolved, the better for all concerned. While Constance found being taken into Gig's confidence confusing, he told Final Gig, quote, he was a nice man. Money, which had frequently been a source of contention, especially lately with the renovations and with Gig not working, Kim decided to find Gig some lucrative endorsement deals. She was also perturbed by her husband's will, which split his estate between her and his sister, as well as giving a sum of $7,500 to his former girlfriend, Harriet Vine Douglas. Harriet claimed that Gig had called her on October 17th to say that Kim had drawn up a revised will that cut out Harriet and his sister, leaving everything to Kim. Harriet says that Gig told her that he refused to sign it. He wasn't going there. And so to retaliate against Gig, Kim ices her husband out. She's upset about the will. And for a sensitive man like Gig, this is unbearable because he needs constant attention and reassurance. He has also stopped taking his nightly cocktail of sleeping pills, so he's a zombie, essentially. The author of Final Gig, George Eales, concludes that Gig realizes he's made a mistake in marrying Kim, and that he just can't face the humiliation of another failed marriage. He begs Harriet to come and whisk him away to Hollywood, to extricate him from what for him had become an intolerable situation. Harriet, who had written to Gig's rescue many times over the years, refused, believing that she would bring in the cavalry only to discover that he and Kim had kissed and made up, and she'd look like a fool. She can't take that humiliation, and she said, you know what, no way, man. You're going to have to figure this one out all on your own. October 19th, 1978. It was an ordinary day, as these days tend to be. It was Thursday. Gig and Kim have been married about 3 weeks. He calls down to the Osborne's doorman to inquire about the weather. Kim called the Grenoble Market to order groceries. Total cost, $23.30. While the doorman thought that Gig calling to ask him about the weather meant he was perhaps headed out, the truth is neither Kim nor Gig left the apartment the entire day. Nobody knows what was said between Mr. and Mrs. Young, whether they fought, whether they spent the day in silence, occasionally uttering the mundane things that married couples sometimes mutter to each other. What is not in dispute is that at around 2:30 in the afternoon, Gig retrieved a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson from a secret panel he had built inside of a hidden cabinet in apartment 1BB, aimed it at the back of Kim's head, and pulled the trigger, killing her instantly. He then turned the gun on himself, shoving the barrel into his mouth and squeezing the trigger. Kim Schmidt was 31 years old. Gig Young was 64. According to police reports, the crime scene suggested that Gig had perhaps acted impulsively, maybe brought on by a psychotic break or a drug and alcohol-induced frenzy. However, the autopsy showed no alcohol or depressants in his system, meaning he was stone cold sober. In the apartment, police found multiple bottles of vitamins, 2 bottles of wine, and 7 tablets of sleeping pills. Gig left behind no suicide note, nor had he recorded what had happened into his tape recorder, a habit he had developed over the years of recording the day's events as some sort of therapeutic release and analysis. Investigators developed the theory that Kim had planned to leave Gig, and that's what ignited him to kill them both. They believed Kim walking out on him was yet another in a long line of humiliations at the hands of a vindictive, lying wife or vengeful lover, and he couldn't take it, couldn't face it. As George Eales noted in Final Gig, Gig must have sensed that this was the only solution to his lifetime feelings of loneliness and inferiority, and that, quote, sitting in apartment 1BB, Gig Young was old, tired, spent. He must have welcomed the oncoming dark. Gig Young was buried in the family plot in Waynesville, North Carolina, while Kim's resting place is in Victoria, Australia. Gig left his Oscar for They Shoot Horses, Don't They, to his longtime agent Martin Baum, and left his abandoned daughter Jennifer $10, which he only did that to keep the will from being contested. As Gig's daughter and eventually his only surviving relative, in 1994, Jennifer made plans to sue Martin Baum for the Oscar after several unsuccessful attempts to get him to turn it over to her. The matter was settled in 1997 with Martin Baum agreeing to bequeath the Oscar to Jennifer upon his death. He passed away in 2013 and the Oscar was subsequently turned over to Jennifer. Detective Richard Chartrand, who investigated the murder-suicide, said in Final Gig, quote, to this day, I avoid looking at Gig Young movies when they're on television. I don't know why. Probably because I can still see him lying on the floor in a pool of blood. It just doesn't jibe with that smooth charmer on the screen. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, and show your love for The Dark Side of Love by visiting thedarksideoflove.com for show notes and transcripts. While you're there, sign up for my newsletter to be notified about new episodes. You can also find a link to my Patreon page where you can access bonus material and other fun stuff. Learn more about my suspense novels about the dark side of love by visiting biancasloan.com. Thanks for hanging out with me, and join me next time for another tale of love gone wrong. I'll see you on the dark side.